So, you know, the context of this discussion of exchange rate pass-through in theory would be a discussion of the real exchange rate. So, you know, what is the real exchange rate? Well, the real exchange rate is the relative price of a basket of goods in one country compared to another after you've translated into a common currency. So, you know, if you look at this slide here, if I define the real exchange rate as Q, you get the price in some home country. You can imagine that's the US, divided by the price level in a foreign country times the exchange rate to convert that price level into dollars, where of course, in this notation, it would mean that the exchange rate is the number of US dollars per foreign currency unit. And PPP, the purchasing power parity theory that would suggest these price levels are exactly the same, can be translated essentially as saying that the real exchange rate is equal to 1. Now, most basic theories, you know, things that you covered as undergrads, presumably, that try to put a little structure on what would be the determinant of this real exchange rate, to separate essentially goods into traded and non-traded goods. And if you do so under the assumption of Cobb-Douglas preferences over those traded and non-traded goods, you know, you can see you get a price index of the kind that I'm circling here on the slide. And so of course you can inject that back into the initial equation and basically divide up the real exchange rate into, you know, a traded component and a non-traded component. And, you know, it's in that context that a lot of basic theories, like the way I teach undergrads or MBAs, Balassa-Samuelson, you assume that this first term, this traded sector term, is where the law of one price is most likely to hold. If there is a place where PPP in theory, you know, would hold, or law of one price, better put, you'd think it's in the traded sector where arbitrage would be an important disciplining force. So of course, it's a natural place to begin empirical analyses of how prices vary across countries. And that's sort of where we'll get going. So if you take and focus just on that traded sector, and you think about, you know, a typical kind of pass-through relationship, what you probably have in mind is this idea that, you know, the price of some good Z in country I, let's imagine country I is the US, so you can think of this as the US dollar price at time T of that good Z. You know, you want to relate it, and under the law of one price, it would exactly equal that foreign price in country J of that good Z, translated into dollars by multiplying it by E. And that, of course, if you then take log differences, motivates a pass-through regression of the kind I'm circling here in the middle of the screen. In principle, you should have, you know, something like the log change on the left-hand side of the import price, if I is the US and it's an importer in dollars, let's say, as a linear function, you know, the sum of two linearly additive terms, the log change in the exchange rate, where remember this would be denoted as a dollar depreciation, given the way we've defined E, and the change in the price abroad. And this exchange rate pass-through regression is, of course, implemented in many different ways at many different levels of aggregation using many different types of data. Quite commonly, the treatment of this foreign price is either ignored or assumed away or proxied with a price index of some kind, where then the pass-through coefficient of interest is this beta. The idea that law of one price would imply a beta value equal to 1. But a very long, rich history has shown, rich literature has shown that beta estimates are almost never at 1. Particularly in the literature looking at pass-through into US import prices, you know, one of the puzzles, one of the interesting features is that in recent decades, beta has been estimated at being quite low. Okay, so that's sort of the setting in which we're at. Now, before I get into kind of how to think in theory about incomplete pass-through, just want to motivate why we might care about it. You know, one is anytime we're writing down a multi-country model, and in the end of today's section, for example, I'll describe such a model. You know, one of the ways that shocks transmit across countries is through prices. And so understanding the nature of that transmission and the extent of that transmission is important, and of course, very closely related to pass-through. Pass-through rates are going to show up in frameworks on optimal monetary policy. It's going to matter for optimal trade policy if you wanted to put in a strategic tariff, for example, or for those that remember the discussion of border adjustment taxes in 2016 and 2017, a critical issue in thinking about that public finance issue was what was the degree of pass-through. And because, as we'll get to in a second, pass-through tells us something about how when an exchange rate changes, marginal costs and markups change. It's also very closely related to, understanding how globalization and trade relates to competition, productivity. And finally, the most, sort of dry, straightforward, I don't mean dry in a negative sense, but the most straightforward interest in exchange rate pass-through might just come from an interest in understanding a country's inflation dynamics. If your country has an exchange rate movement and you want to understand what that's likely to mean for your country's inflation, obviously you need to think about pass-through. Okay, so the way I would start is with the most basic first order condition that's going to come out of any super simple static flexible price maximization problem, where a firm wants to maximize revenues less costs by setting a price. And you get this expression that the price P, and in this case, let's assume it's the dollar price that an exporter would be setting on sales to the US, is equal to some markup term here times the marginal cost expressed in dollars. And again, I'm going to stick with the convention that E is the dollar price of a unit of foreign currency, such that MC then would be the foreign currency denominated marginal cost. Now this markup, of course, is itself a function of the elasticity of demand for the good. So it's the elasticity minus the elasticity minus 1, where this, E or epsilon might be something, like 2, 3, 4, a positive value. Now, if you take log differences of this top expression, then, you get that the change in, or you should really think of this as the percentage change, because it's a log change in the import price, is equal to the percentage change in the markup plus the percentage change in the marginal cost plus the percentage depreciation in the value of the dollar. And you can essentially think of it this way, that the percentage change in the import price relative to the percentage change in the exchange rate is going to be equal to 1 unless there's some countervailing or offsetting force imposed by changes in markups or in marginal costs. Why, in theory, would there potentially be a change in markup in response to a change in the exchange rate? Well, imagine that the dollar, depreciates, and you're a Japanese exporter to the US, so the yen strengthened. Well, then all else equal, you're much less competitive in the US market. All else equal, your good will now cost more. Your market share might go down. And in a lot of demand systems, in order to preserve the maximal level of profits, you'll want in response to that to lower your markups, to charge a more competitive price. And therefore, you can imagine that this term would be negative. Why might the marginal cost change in response to the exchange rates movement? There's really two key issues that I'll get to in a second. One would be if you happen to be an importer of goods that are used as inputs into production. Imagine that Japanese importer, or that Japanese exporter, was also an importer of intermediate inputs from the US. Well, then it's true that the yen's appreciation that I just used as an example would kind of hurt them on the export side, but it would also potentially lower the price of their intermediate inputs, therefore offering some offset there. Another reason why the marginal cost might move with the exchange rate is just if you have non-constant returns to scale. If the exchange rate moves and your price, and therefore your quantity, is going to move, all else equal, and you either have an increasing or decreasing marginal cost of production at that point in the production schedule, well, then that's yet another force that will matter for pass-through. Okay, so if there's no change in markups, no change in marginal costs in a static, flexible price world, you'll have pass-through equal to 1. Incomplete pass-through, again, when we have a flexible prices sort of static setting, it can be attributed to this change in marginal cost or change in the markup co-moving with the exchange rate. So how do you generate such co-movement? Well, here I'm going to have to largely just give you a bunch of references and suggest that those that haven't worked in this area but want to embed this sort of dynamic in their work, what I would recommend is that you go through some of these different frameworks and derive the elasticity of demand that emerges yourself. And you'll be able to, from that elasticity of demand, determine if markups will be variable or not, and therefore if that channel can lead to incomplete pass-through or not. So the most standard, I would argue, or one of the most standard demand setups in these frameworks is a CES demand framework. I'm going to assume everyone knows what that means, but here you can see I've written it as, imagine you have CES demand over varieties V or sectors V. Well, these sectors each have an elasticity of demand for their goods equal to sigma, and precisely sigma, where sigma is a parameter. So as a result, whether one of these V's gets more or less expensive, increases or decreases its market share, the demand for it will still be characterized by an elasticity of sigma, and therefore the optimal markup will not change. The markup would be set at sigma over sigma minus 1, and that's it. Okay, so that's not a system that would lead to variable markups. Other systems, though, that do, I would start with a nested CES demand system. Imagine we kept this same structure at the sector level where V is a sector, but we allowed each V, each good or sector V, to itself be a CES aggregation over, let's call them varieties Z. That's why it's called a nested CES, where the elasticities differ. In this case, the inner nest has an elasticity of eta, the outer nest has an elasticity of sigma. And you'd most naturally think of sigma, by the way, as lower than eta, because you might think of sigma as governing the elasticity between, buying automobiles and healthcare and real estate, whereas eta would be about the elasticity of goods within healthcare or within real estate or within education. And so that difference between sigma and eta in these models generates a formula like this for the elasticity of substitution, where you get that it's variable and is essentially a weighted average of the two elasticities, where the weight here, S of Z, is the market share of that good Z in that sector V. You get a slightly different weighted average if you assume quantity competition versus price competition, but the point is this is a model where when the exchange rate moves, a firm's position in its market will change, its elasticity will therefore change, and its markup will therefore change. Okay? If I asked you to take any paper and sort of derive it pen and paper as an exercise and make sure you could derive yourself these elasticities to really deeply understand where all this comes about, I would refer you to Atkinson and Burstein 2008. The very last page of my slides gives the full references for all these. And a very minor aside, this was the genesis of my job market paper. For those that are looking for inspiration, I tried to literally derive every single expression in Atkinson and Burstein when it was a working paper, and only in doing that did I get some ideas that ultimately literally became my job market paper. Linear demand is another form of demand that will lead to a variable elasticity of demand and variable markups. This is what a linear demand system looks like, and I would refer you to the Melitz and Ottaviano paper as a great source to try to derive that, see the advantages or disadvantages of generating variable markups that way. Bergen and Feenstra is a nice example of how to do it in a symmetric translog system. Clino and Willis in 2016 sort of have an implementation of the kinked demand system from Miles Kimball's work, I think from 1995. Again, that's going to generate an elasticity that changes over based on the firm's position in the market and therefore generates variable markups. I think Gopinath Ithoki and Rigo Bone is a very nice implementation of that demand structure to generate incomplete pass-through. Getting toward the end, but I want to just quickly note again that in addition to variable markups generating incomplete pass-through, variable marginal costs can generate incomplete pass-through, or I should say variable marginal costs are marginal costs that vary with the exchange rate. So one way that this can occur, of course, is if you have simply non-constant returns to scale. So that's an easy one. But then also imagine that the firm, as I mentioned, that's exporting is also importing. And so its marginal cost is not only a function of its own country's wage, but also of the foreign country's wage that's producing the good that it uses as an input. And if you imagine that they combine domestic and foreign inputs in a Cobb-Douglas sort of way with an output or Cobb-Douglas output elasticity beta, you get something like this in this setup, holding wages fixed, but allowing the exchange rate to vary. You'd get a change in the marginal cost of beta minus 1, which, since beta ranges between 0 and 1, is a negative number. And so, of course, this means that even if markups didn't move, you had a CES structure. If you allow for intermediate inputs to be imported from abroad, you can get pass-through to be less than 1, or in the case I just described, equal essentially to beta. Now, everything I just described is in a flexible price, static setup where prices are constantly changing. In the real world, it's of course quite important to think about price stickiness for pass-through. Historically, we thought of a world where exporters always set their prices in their own currency. And therefore, during the period in which their prices were sticky in their own currency, that's something called producer currency pricing, or PCP, pass-through by definition, by construction, would equal 1. An alternative that became popular in models after people observed that the US dollar share of imports into the US was quite high was LCP, which is when you think of the prices being sticky in the country to which you're selling. In that case, over the period of time that you don't change, the sticker price of the good, pass-through necessarily is 0. Then finally, there's been a lot of recent work, particularly by Gita Gopinath and co-authors, describing as dominant currency pricing the idea that maybe a dominant currency, in this case they have in mind the US dollar, is what most goods are invoiced in. And then of course it's an intermediate range, right? It's not just 0 or 1, it sort of depends on how that country's bilateral exchange rate with the dollar moves. Because I'm a little bit low on time and want to make sure that Alberto can tell you more about the data, just kind of want to note that in a dynamic setting, even above and beyond the price stickiness issues I just described, many other factors can play and cause incomplete pass-through. On the previous slide, I mentioned things like real rigidities and strategic complementarities. Imagine my prices change in even months, but Alberto is a competitor firm whose prices change in odd months. Well, then we might want to limit the extent to which we fully achieve our ideal price because we don't want to have our relative prices move too quickly relative to each other. One might expect mean reversion in the exchange rate shocks, which in a dynamic setting with some price rigidity could cause incomplete pass-through. There's also investment style models, things like that, which are worth exploring that can cause exchange rate pass-through to be intermediate, where perhaps you want to have a cheap price in the beginning of the life of the good to gain market share and then increase it later. So let me wrap up just with this final reference list for future readings. But for those interested in deriving those elasticities I mentioned earlier, I believe they're all listed here. And now I'll turn it over to Alberto, who will tell you a little bit about pass-through in the data. And after Alberto's session, we can stop and take a pause if there are any questions on the sum of the two sessions.
Very good. Thank you, Brent. So I'm going to